Her hands were empty. No scroll, no seal, no proof she could place on the table. Only one sentence. I have seen the Lord. But the room was still locked by fear. Mary Magdalene had just come from the garden, from the empty tomb, from the place where grief had been interrupted by the voice of the risen Jesus. She had heard him call her name. She had been sent with the first words of resurrection hope. And yet, when she returned, the people she loved were still afraid. This is not a story about revenge. This is not a story about hidden conspiracy. This is the sacred story of a witness who seemed too wounded to be believed but was never forgotten by God. Because sometimes the miracle has already begun behind the stone, behind the tears, behind the silence, behind the door no one is ready to open. Her hands were empty. No scroll, no seal, no official witness standing beside her. No object she could place on a table and say, "Here, this proves it." The tomb had given her no body to carry back. The garden had given her no document, no signature, no public declaration from the authorities, only a sentence so impossible that any frightened room might hesitate before receiving it. Mary Magdalene came with breath still uneven, dawn still clinging to the edges of the world, and the words entrusted to her. I have seen the Lord. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. John's Gospel tells us that later that day, the disciples were behind locked doors because of fear. We should be careful here. Scripture does not say a door was slammed in Mary's face. It does not give us every glance, every silence, every first reaction in the room. But it does give us enough to feel the spiritual weight of that day. There was a locked room. There was fear. There was a woman carrying news too large for grief to easily receive. And between those realities stood one of the most human tensions in sacred history. God had already acted, but the hearts of the wounded were still trying to understand. This is not a story about Mary defeating the disciples. It is not a story about revenge, hidden conspiracy, or a secret truth buried by the church. The gospel memory has preserved Mary's witness with reverence. This is a story about what happens when a miracle begins before anyone is ready to believe it. Behind the stone, God had already prepared life. Behind Mary's tears, God had prepared recognition. And behind the locked door, God was preparing peace. But before Mary ever stood near that room of fear, before her words entered the silence of those who loved Jesus and had lost him, she had gone to another door first. The entrance of a tomb, and that door had already been opened. Mary did not come to the tomb looking for history. She came because love still needed somewhere to go. The world around her was still dark, or near enough to darkness that the first light had not yet softened the sorrow. The air would have been cool, the ground quiet, the kind of morning when every sound feels too loud because grief has made the soul listen too closely. Jesus had been crucified, the teacher she followed, the one who had called people out of shame and into mercy, the one who had spoken of life as if death did not have the final word, had been killed publicly. The cross had not been a private wound. It had been visible, brutal, humiliating. And now Mary came to the tomb. John's Gospel places her there early, while it was still dark. That detail matters. The darkness was not only in the sky, it was in the human understanding of everyone who had loved him. The disciples did not yet know what God had done. Mary did not yet know what God had done. She knew only what grief knew. The body was supposed to be there. The stone was supposed to seal the place where love could still come and mourn. But the stone had been moved. At first, that did not look like a miracle. To Mary, it looked like another wound. That is one of the most painful truths in this story. Sometimes the first sign of God's work looks, to the wounded heart, like one more loss. Mary did not see the open tomb and immediately say, "He is risen." She saw the disturbed place and thought someone had taken him away. That mistaken belief was not foolish. It was human. When sorrow has already taken so much, the mind learns to expect more sorrow. When the worst has happened, the heart can begin to believe the worst is all that remains. Mary had seen enough suffering to think the empty tomb meant desecration, theft, one final insult against the one she loved. She was not only grieving his death, she was grieving the disappearance of the last place where love could stand near him. The tomb had become, in her mind, the final address of devotion. If she could not hear his voice, she could at least come near the place where his body lay. If she could not follow him through the villages anymore, she could stand in the garden and refuse to let love vanish. But now even that seemed taken. There is a sacred wound in this moment that many people understand. It is the wound of trying to remain faithful when the last visible sign of hope appears to disappear. It is the wound of standing before an empty place and thinking, even this was not left for me. Mary's tears were not weakness. They were evidence that love had stayed. And that is why this story must be told carefully. Her grief did not disqualify her. Her sorrow did not make her unreliable in the eyes of Jesus. Her tears brought her to the place where revelation would meet history. She thought she was standing at the scene of an additional loss, but heaven knew she was standing at the edge of the greatest reversal the world had ever seen. Mary thought someone had taken Jesus away. She did not yet know that death itself had already lost him. The garden held its silence. Mary was still trying to understand what could not yet fit inside her grief. The empty tomb had opened a question she did not know how to answer. The place of death was empty, but the meaning of that emptiness was still hidden from her. Then she saw someone. John's Gospel tells us she thought he was the gardener. That mistaken recognition is tender, almost painfully human. She was standing in the place of resurrection, looking at the risen Jesus, and still she did not know him. Not because she lacked love, not because she lacked faithfulness, but because grief can stand directly in front of mercy and still not recognize it at first. There is no need to make Mary less faithful in this moment. If anything, the scene makes her more human. She is not performing certainty. She is not pretending to understand what she does not understand. She is still searching, still aching, still asking where her Lord has been taken. Then Jesus speaks. Not a long explanation, not a theological lecture, not a defense of what God has done. He says her name, Mary, and everything changes. Sometimes God does not begin by explaining the miracle. Sometimes he begins by calling your name. Before Mary carried the message, she was first recognized. Before she was sent to speak, she was seen. Before she entered the room of fear, she stood in the garden of recognition and heard the risen Christ call her personally. This is the hidden truth at the center of the story. Mary was not merely a mourner who happened to stumble into history. Her grief had not made her invisible to God. Her tears had not made her useless. Her love had brought her to the place where the miracle would be revealed. The one she thought was gone was standing before her. The one she thought had been taken had conquered what no human hand could conquer. The tomb was empty not because love had been robbed, but because death had been defeated. This moment must remain sacred. There is no need for speculation, no need for sensational claims about Mary Magdalene, no need to twist the relationship between Mary and Jesus into something the gospel does not give us. The emotional center is holy trust, recognition, calling, witness, obedience. Jesus does not give Mary a weapon. He gives her a witness. He does not send her to humiliate anyone. He sends her to announce what God has done, and that commission changes the direction of the story. Mary cannot remain in the garden, holding the moment for herself. Revelation becomes responsibility. Comfort becomes calling. The voice that healed her sorrow now entrusts her with a message. In John's Gospel, Mary Magdalene stands at the center of this personal encounter with the risen Jesus. Christian memory has often honored her as a faithful witness to the resurrection, and many Christians across the centuries have called her apostle to the apostles. We should be careful with titles and traditions, because different Christian communities emphasize her role in different ways. But we should not miss the meaning preserved here. The one who came to mourn was sent to speak. The one who thought she had lost the last place of love was given the first words of living hope. And the moment Jesus spoke her name, Mary's grief became a mission. Mary left the garden carrying what her hands could not hold. That is the strange detail that gives this story its tension. She had seen the risen Lord, but she did not carry proof that could force belief. No Roman seal, no signed testimony from officials, no public announcement from the temple courts, no object she could lift before the disciples and say, "This will make you understand." Her hands were still empty, but her heart was not. She carried memory. She carried his voice. She carried the shock of recognition. She carried the words he had entrusted to her. She carried testimony. And in the gospel, testimony matters. Still, testimony can be costly, especially when it reaches people who are wounded, afraid, and unable to imagine that joy could be true so soon after devastation. Mary knew where she was going. She was going back to the disciples, back to the people who had loved Jesus, followed Jesus, failed in fear, suffered in confusion, and now gathered under the shadow of danger. They were not villains. They were not caricatures of unbelief. They were human beings shattered by the cross. That matters. A respectful telling of this story must leave room for their grief. The disciples had seen hope arrested. They had seen power crush innocence. They had seen the one they called Lord taken from them in a way that made the future feel unsafe. Fear has a way of locking more than doors. It locks imagination. It locks expectation. It locks the heart against joy because joy feels too dangerous to trust. Mary's journey back from the garden, then, was not simply a walk from one place to another. It was the movement of resurrection into the territory of fear. The light had begun outside, but the room she was going to still lived under the emotional weather of Friday. That is why her calling was not easy. Being sent by Christ did not guarantee that everyone would immediately understand. Being chosen as a witness did not remove the loneliness of carrying a truth before others could bear it. Sometimes the first evidence of calling is not applause. Sometimes it is obedience in the space between what God has shown you and what people are ready to receive. Mary did not go back to win an argument. She went back because Jesus sent her. That distinction protects the sacredness of the story. This is not a revenge drama. Mary is not marching toward the disciples to prove her superiority. She is not carrying resentment. She is carrying news. I have seen the Lord. Those words were simple, but simple words can carry eternity when God places them in the mouth of a witness. And now the message had to travel from the Garden of Life into a room still ruled by fear. Imagine the room carefully, not as a courtroom, not as a place filled with cruel men waiting to reject Mary. Imagine it as a wounded room. The light is low. Voices are quiet. Every sound outside could mean danger. Someone may be near the door. Someone may be listening for footsteps. Someone may still be replaying the events of the cross in his mind, wondering how courage failed so quickly, how promises collapsed so easily, how the future became so dark. John tells us the disciples were behind locked doors because of fear. The point is not to assign blame to an entire people or to turn the moment into a simplistic accusation. The point is spiritual and human. After the crucifixion, fear had entered the room and made itself at home. Then, Mary's words entered. I have seen the Lord. There should have been joy. But joy is not always received quickly by those who have been living under terror. Perhaps there was silence. Perhaps someone looked up too sharply. Perhaps another lowered his eyes, unsure whether to hope or protect himself from hope. Perhaps someone repeated the words, as if trying to understand them. Seen the Lord? The gospel does not give us every reaction in that room. Luke's gospel preserves the painful memory that the women's announcement was first received as unbelievable by the apostles. John gives us Mary's testimony with sacred simplicity, held carefully together. These memories help us feel the wound without exaggerating it. Mary had seen the risen Christ, but the room had not, and for a moment, the distance between her witness and their fear must have felt enormous. This is the public confrontation of the story, but it is not loud. It is the confrontation between living testimony and locked fear. It is the moment when the words of resurrection enter a space still behaving as if death has won. The first false explanation is painfully understandable. She is grieving. Maybe sorrow has overwhelmed her. Maybe she misunderstood. Maybe the empty tomb confused her. Maybe love has made her imagine what everyone desperately wishes were true. That is the wound. Her grief, the very grief that brought her to the garden, could become the reason her witness was hard to receive. Many viewers know that wound in their own lives, the wound of telling the truth while others hear only emotion, the wound of carrying something real and being treated as if pain has made you unreliable, the wound of being present, faithful, and devoted, yet still not fully believed. Mary's credibility was the first thing threatened in that room, not because the disciples had to be evil, but because fear can make even faithful hearts slow to receive joy. That is the cost of fear. Fear delayed peace. Fear delayed comfort. Fear made the room hesitate before the gift God had already sent. And Mary stood in the middle of it with no object to force belief. No proof she could press into their hands. No way to make the garden appear before them. Only the testimony Jesus had given her. This is her intimate spiritual wound. She was not alone because there were no people around her. She was alone because she carried a truth no one else could yet fully receive. That kind of loneliness is deep. To be surrounded by people who love the same Lord, but to stand ahead of them in recognition, to bring comfort and meet caution, to carry joy into a place still loyal to grief. The first resurrection witness entered a room where death still had the loudest voice. And yet Mary's testimony did not become false because the room hesitated. A locked door cannot undo an empty tomb. Fear cannot reverse the voice that called her name. Silence cannot erase what the risen Christ has entrusted. For a moment, the first witness carried joy alone, but she was not forgotten. Mary's vindication did not come because she argued louder. It came because the risen Christ stood behind the words he gave her. That is the restoration this story needs. Not revenge, not humiliation turned back upon the fearful, not a scene where Mary defeats the disciples and stands above them. That would be too small for a resurrection story. The true restoration is holier than that. What had been threatened was her voice, her credibility, her belonging, her sacred authority as a witness, and her place in memory. What God restored was exactly that. First, Jesus restored her personally. Before any room received her, he called her by name. Before any human being knew how to honor her witness, Christ had already seen her. That means her dignity did not depend on immediate acceptance. Her calling began in the garden, not in the approval of the room. Second, her testimony entered the community. Even if fear slowed the moment, it could not bury the message. The words had crossed the threshold. The witness had been spoken. The miracle that began behind the stone was now moving behind the locked door. And third, sacred memory preserved her. Later Christian memory has often honored Mary Magdalene as a faithful witness to the resurrection. Some traditions have called her apostle to the apostles, not because she replaced the 12, but because she was sent to announce what she had seen. The historical and theological language should be handled with care, but the meaning is clear enough to feel. The witness, who could have been dismissed, was not erased. The woman whose grief could have been misunderstood was remembered. The one who came with empty hands carried words the church would never forget. That is the miracle behind the scenes. It was not only that the stone had been moved, it was that God was also moving fear, slowly, patiently, mercifully, from the human heart. The resurrection did not only open a tomb, it began opening locked rooms. And that is why this story still speaks. Because many people know what it feels like to stand before a closed door. Not always a wooden door. Sometimes it is the closed door of a family that does not understand. The closed door of a prayer that seems unanswered. The closed door of a community that sees your pain before it sees your faith. The closed door of being faithful in silence while no one seems to recognize what God is doing in you. Mary's story does not promise that every person will understand immediately. It offers something deeper. It says that being doubted by people does not mean being forgotten by God. It says that grief may bring you to a place where others think the story is over, but God may have already begun the miracle. It says that the empty hands of a faithful witness can still carry eternity. Behind the stone, God had already prepared life. Behind Mary's tears, God had prepared recognition. Behind the locked door, God was preparing peace. And behind every moment when her witness seemed too fragile to survive, the risen Christ was the truth that held it. So the final image is not Mary standing outside forever. It is not fear having the last word. It is a closed door slowly losing its power. It is dawn reaching the threshold. It is a room beginning, however slowly, to understand that Friday did not win. And it is Mary Magdalene's witness, echoing beyond the walls of fear, beyond the silence of hesitation, beyond the centuries of Christian memory. I have seen the Lord. The story of Mary Magdalene after the resurrection carries a message that is both ancient and deeply personal. Being misunderstood by people does not mean being forgotten by God. Mary came to the tomb in grief. She did not arrive expecting to become part of sacred history. She came because love had not let go. And in the place where she thought hope had ended, Jesus called her by name. That is the first lesson. God often meets people in the very place they thought was only loss. But the story does not end in the garden. Mary is sent back with a message, and that message has to enter a room still ruled by fear. This is where the story becomes painfully human. Sometimes God gives someone a truth, a calling, a testimony, or a burden before others are ready to understand it. That does not mean the witness is false. It means fear may need time to surrender. The deeper lesson is not that Mary was better than the disciples. The disciples were wounded, afraid, and trying to survive the shock of the cross. The lesson is that fear can make even faithful hearts slow to receive joy. Mary's restoration comes not through revenge, but through divine vindication. Jesus had already seen her. Jesus had already called her. Jesus had already sent her. For anyone who has ever felt dismissed, doubted, unseen, or spiritually alone, this story whispers a sacred truth. The closed door is not always the end. The silence is not always abandonment. The empty hands may still carry holy purpose. God may already be preparing the miracle behind the scenes. If this story touched something in you, take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who needs to remember that God has not forgotten them. And before you leave, I want to ask you something personal. Have you ever had a season where you felt like Mary, carrying something true in your heart, but feeling unseen, unheard, or misunderstood by the people around you? Maybe you were praying, waiting, grieving, or trying to hold on to faith when the door in front of you seemed closed. What was that season like? And what helped you keep going? Share your thoughts in the comments, because your story may encourage someone else who is still waiting for their own door to open. Subscribe to the channel for more sacred stories of Jesus, biblical witnesses, forgotten faith, and the quiet ways God restores what the world overlooks. In the next video, we'll explore another powerful story of faith, silence, and divine restoration, a moment where God was working long before anyone understood what he was doing.